Thank you all. Thank you for coming. It's wonderful to have with us today first of all, it's wonderful to be in partnership with the Center for Lebanese Studies. History has this quirk that after almost 15 years, I'm rejoining the Center for Lebanese Studies in an event at LAU where we're both situated. And it's also wonderful to have with us Lex Takkenberg and Francesca Albanese, who are going to talk about the new edition of this huge tome, which is the new edition of Palestinian refugees in international law. Now, we've all been raised on the first edition, and this is a much more enlarged edition with a lot of information from the ground and from all the host countries. It's really a very valuable work, and the index is quite good. So it's not it's very user friendly. So I'm going. So let me first introduce our two speakers. So we have Francesca Albanese, who is a research affiliate for the study of international migration at Georgetown University and a visiting scholar at the Issam Fares Institute at AUB. She is an international lawyer specializing in human rights and refugee issues in the Arab world. She has 15 years of professional experience working with the UN and with UNRWA in particular in our region, and with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, with the EU as an electoral assistant, with the UNDP, and lots of other NGOs. She's a graduate of Pisa University in law, and she has an LLM from SOAS. And of course, Dr. Lex Takkenberg has worked with, he is UNRWA for a lot of us. Lex has worked with UNRWA from 1989 until 2019. And he's now a freelance lecturer and consultant. He used to be in charge of the UNRWA Ethics Office. And before that, he was UNRWA General Counsel. He was their lawyer in residence. If you like, we all went to him for anything, any clarification. And the Bible for that was the first edition of this book. He was also director of operations. He was deputy field director in Gaza and Syria. And before joining UNRWA, he was a legal officer at the Dutch Refugee Council for 6 years. He graduated from the University of Amsterdam, and he obtained a doctorate from the University of Nijmegen in the Netherlands. We'll be joined later by Oroob Al-Abed. I'm delighted that Oroob can join us. She will come with when we finish the beginning of the presentation. And Oroob is with the Center for Lebanese Studies. She is a principal investigator in Jordan for a project that the CLS has, and she's honorary postdoc at SOAS. She has her PhD also from SOAS, and she's worked on refugees everywhere. She has a lot of experience with government institutions. She's been affiliated to many universities and international NGOs, and is a specialist on forced migration in the Middle East. Now, I'm going to first ask Francesca to kick off with updating us what's happening on the refugee front. So things have been very quiet on the negotiations. Of course, since 2014, there hasn't been even an initiative for negotiations since the Kerry initiative. There's been many developments on the ground, of course. There's been many developments with UNRWA. But what's the framework through which we are discussing refugees? Is there a legal framework or an institutional framework other than the official negotiations that we're following?
Thank you, Nadine, and thank you for hosting us and to discuss the main issues we present in the book. Let me start first of all with something that is not new, and is namely who Palestinian refugees are, and this is for the benefit to those in the audience who might not be familiar with the subject matter. Palestinian refugees at large are first and foremost those who were displaced and dispossessed as a consequence of the nearly 40-year process that led to the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 over a large part of the land that until that moment had been known as Palestine. Second, those who were dispossessed and displaced from the conflict that in 1967 led to the expansion of Israel's control over the land that remained from 1948 for the realization of the state of Palestine, namely the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. Those are commonly referred to as 1967 displaced, but they are refugees for the purpose of international law. And third, the descendants of both groups. Today, they number over 7 million out of 30 million Palestinians globally. And they're mainly although not exclusively in the Middle East, namely the occupied Palestine, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, and other Arab countries from the Maghreb till the Gulf countries, but also in Europe and the Americas, and increasingly in the last decade in the Asia Pacific and Africa. Israel's denials of the right of the refugees to return to their homes as of 1947-49, as well as its mass denationalization of Palestinian refugees in 1952, has made other durable solutions politically unfeasible, leaving the majority of the dispersed Palestinians with a precarious status, largely as stateless refugees, and vulnerable, as the facts demonstrate, to further displacement. The situation of these refugees, including descendants scattered around the world, remains to be resolved in line with international law and relevant UN resolutions. In many respects, it is similar to that of many of the 16 million refugees in protracted refugee situation worldwide, but also different, where the element of refugeehood is just one characterizing the Palestinian refugee legal status under international law. What better defines their reality, and which is not fully captured by one legal category only, is that of being orphans of a homeland, which was one day and is no more, to use the words of Edward Said. And this is what has remained largely unchanged since 1948. So what is new? What has happened over the last few years with respect to Palestinian refugees? As you rightly pointed out at the beginning, I mean, in recent years, it seems that, actually I say from the Oslo process onward, it seems that gradually the Palestinian refugee issue has fallen off the map of the official political discourse, and it's treated, the matter is treated in the dominant political arguments as a nuisance, as an obstacle to peace at best. But as we speak, the reality of Palestinian refugees and UNRWA, the UN Relief and Work Agency for Palestinian refugees that has served them in the Near East since 1950, appears to be gloomier than ever. Why? First of all, I would point to something that is affecting the whole world, but is impacting particularly UNRWA at the moment. the spread of COVID-19 disease has deteriorated an already dire humanitarian situation across most of UNRWA's areas of operations, in the West Bank and Gaza under occupation, with the latter also being under blockade. Syria trapped in a 9-year violent war, and Lebanon in a downward political and economic spiral. At the time of increased demand for UNRWA services, the worsening financial conditions of the agency have further impaired its ability to respond. But the dire situation UNRWA in particular is facing is not only of financial nature, because in recent years, UNRWA has been the target of a series of attacks leveled against its mandate and operations in a disingenuous attempt to further weaken the political stand of Palestinian refugees. And there have been dozens of political acolytes and pundits in the US, Israel, and beyond who have routinely accused UNRWA to operate outside the international refugee regime and perpetuate the refugee crisis by developing its own definition of Palestinian refugees, different from any other refugees worldwide, and by registering illegitimate refugees, like Palestine refugees descendant over generations. But these claims are factually and legally wrong. Nevertheless, in 2018, they were used to justify the US administration's decision to halt its long-standing partnership with UNRWA and completely defund the agency. They also serve as a political, they also serve a political purpose, which is to distract from the reality that ending the de facto indefinite refugee status of millions of Palestinian refugees requires political solutions in line with international law. The failure to find such solutions is the cause of the continuous existence of the Palestinian refugee question and the growing number of the refugees, not the other way around. In fact, UNRWA, which like UNHCR is worth remembering, is a subsidiary body of the United Nations General Assembly, and only the General Assembly has the power to decide on its mandate, stands as a symptom of this chronic political deficit, not its cause. Against this background, and this is also something new, the Trump administration's 2020 Peace to Prosperity, longer version of the equally vacuous deal of the century that had been unveiled in 2019, does not go much further than merely acknowledging the existence of the refugees, alluding to those who were displaced in 1948 and of the descendants, without considering any of their rights and aspirations. The plan embraces an extreme colonialist agenda, paving the way for further annexation of Palestinian land, doing away with international law and outstanding international consensus with respect to the question of Palestine, and de facto obliterating the refugee issue altogether. This has marked a new law even for a US presidency, which has accustomed us to a one-sided stance when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian question. Finally, my impression is that for many, UNRWA's desperate financial deficit appears as yet another tedious chapter in a never-ending quarrel between Israelis and Palestinians, a story with too many names, too many bitter memories and distrust, with no end in sight, allegedly due to the parties' inability to seal a deal. And this is why Lex and I believed firmly 5 years ago that an honest and conducive debate around these developments requires getting thereof straight. And this is what we try to do with our book, bringing the facts back to the center of the debate and using the legal lens around what you mentioned, the framework. The framework is international law in all its bodies as it has developed over 70 years and its implications. And I'm happy to further elaborate on that.
Thank you, thank you. And just also, I'd like to ask to bring in Lex here, just to update us on what's happening with UNRWA as an institution. We've heard that there were internal problems, and of course the continuing financial crisis and the boycott by the US. So how is the institution doing, and what's the situation there? Lex?
Lex, you're muted.
Yeah.
Ah.
Yes, thank you very much, Nadim, and greetings from the French countryside near the city of Toulouse. You already mentioned that I left UNRWA now over a year ago, and so I'm no longer the insider that I was for so many years. But obviously still very closely following what's happening with the refugees and the organization. We've already heard Francesca talk about the onslaught on Palestinian refugees by the Trump administration, which dramatically impacted UNRWA's ability to support the 5 million or so Palestinian refugees in its care. The pullback of US funding, roughly 1/3 of the agency's budget, triggered the biggest financial crisis in the organization's history, which is far from over, unfortunately. Although the election of Biden may trigger new opportunities for renewed US funding. In 2018, when first confronted with this major reduction of US funding, the agency managed to capitalize on the shockwaves that the US decision had sent around the world, and no less than 43 countries other than the US decided to increase funding, as a result of which a reduced core budget was more or less funded. At the same time, however, leaving a huge funding gap in the emergency and other programs funded through special contributions, such as the protection program, which the agency had, over the last decade developed really sort of mainstreaming protection in its operation. I mean, this was dramatically affected. In 2019, the agency once again scraped by and was only able to meet the December payroll by borrowing money from the UN Central Emergency Fund. And in 2020, last year, even this was not enough. And for the first time in the agency's history, the payment of salaries for December was deferred to January, essentially using part of 2021 money, of this year's money, to cover obligations of last year, which essentially implies a potentially even bigger funding shortfall at the end of this year. In the meantime, the financial crisis was aggravated by a serious leadership scandal, which triggered the departure of the agency's entire top leadership. Former Commissioner General Craneville's role in the affair came under renewed scrutiny following a broadcast only last month of a Swiss TV documentary, as well as several related articles. A new senior leadership team with excellent credentials joined the agency last year and is still in the process of getting to know the agency while introducing a number of reforms to prevent reoccurrence of the recent scandal, and then trying to overcome the 2020 financial crisis as the year drew to an end. Now, Biden's victory, as well as the new Democratic majorities in both Congress and the Senate, bode well for resumption of US funding to UNRWA, but it still remains to be seen at what level and what will be its impact on funding from other donors. Recent media reports suggest that the normalization agreements that were concluded with Trump's help by a number of countries, both in the Gulf and North Africa, as well as Sudan, may trigger a dramatic reduction in Gulf funding for the agency, And if that's the case, the resumption of US funding may be offset by a comparable reduction of funding from other sources. So still a very sort of glooming situation. UNRWA is planning to address the current situation by holding a major international conference on Palestinian refugees and UNRWA, similar to the one that it organized in Geneva in 2004. Conference will take place probably in the second half of the year. It's not known exactly when and where yet. And we hope it provides an opportunity for critical reflection of the agency's mandates and modes of operation and resource delivery. So the agency continues to do its important work, but under ever more dire financial constraints at the present time, Nadim.
Thank you. Is there any thinking within the agency or outside the agency? I know that there's a group of former UNRWA people that were forming a kind of a think tank to help resolve the problem. Is there any thinking of changing the mandate or involving other agencies, other than just states? I mean, we'll get back to that. I was thinking of the Palestinian diaspora, of
the situation inside UNRWA, unfortunately, the dire financial situation combined with the management crisis that obviously impacted the organization, including its ability to sort of critically reflect on its mandate and aspects of its work, has been considerable, as a result of which there has not been a lot of critical thinking. So in that sense, this opportunity for a new international conference over 15 years after the last sort of bigger conference on UNRWA was held is very welcome. There's considerable thinking, and I believe a bit later in our conversation we can turn to that. There's considerable thinking to take advantage of sort of other international opportunities that are happening on the global international refugee arena, the New York Declaration of 2016, and quite happily you mentioned the Chatham House project. I believe at the moment there is increased engagement on Palestinian refugee issues in the region, facilitated by Jordanian NGO ARDD, and that bodes well for the potential of injecting sort of new thinking, new ideas, both into this new UNRWA conference and more generally around the discourse on Palestinian refugees.
Great, thanks.
And Nadim, and if I can chime in on the issue of the mandate, just in case we don't have the chance to fully return to it later. I think that as our study demonstrates, it's just a matter of looking at what is UNRWA's mandate, because the tendency of the agency, and this is something I have sensed when I was with the legal departments there, and I fully realized going through 70 years of reports of the agency approved by the General Assembly, the mandate of the agency as comforted and supported by international law, and as Lex was pointing out, the development of the international international refugee framework under which UNRWA operates fully supports the realization of much more than humanitarian services. It's like if UNRWA, out of necessity, had been cornered in a humanitarian space, which is much more limited than its potential. And again, it's not about changing the mandate, it's interpreting the international protection mandate that has been established 72 years ago for Palestinian refugees. And hopefully we have made a contribution to this.
Yeah, while we're on this subject, you mentioned the Chatham House. I mean, Lex mentioned the Chatham House project, which was basically a Center for Lebanese Studies and Chatham House project, which went on for about almost 20 years, looking at host country issues and at basically the regional perspective of the refugee issue. And one of the main issues that we always confronted was the crisis of UNRWA. And we were stressing the fact that any implementation of a solution on refugees will require an institution like UNRWA, or in effect, UNRWA would be the only institution qualified with the knowledge of the ground and with the data to help implementing the solution. So that's something that's not in the original mandate, but needs to be maybe emphasized now because the whole institution is being questioned, and it's anyway. Francesca, while you're there, please tell us more about the book, because I don't want this to finish without at least an introduction to the book and what's new in it from the first edition.
Sure. Nadim, I warn you, I tend to be like a broken record. I can talk over and over about these. So feel free. I don't want it to be a monologue. So because this has started as a discussion and it's enjoyable, feel free to interrupt me and come in with questions as I go. But I'm really happy to give an overview of the book, although there are other videos on internet that provide the overall presentation of it. I will try to focus here on the main takeaways, try to stimulate the attendees to read it and to use it.
When you mentioned these, there are excellent presentations you've made that are on YouTube, and I will put a link of them at the bottom of the recording so that people can refer to them later.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So let me say, when 5 years ago, when I considered whether to join Lex as his partner in crime, as he often calls me, meaning in his endeavor to revisit his 1998 edition, I had some years of experience in the Department of Legal Affairs of UNRWA. That experience had convinced me that much more was to be said about the legal dimension of the Palestinian refugee question, and not only to counter the attempts to manipulate the legal arguments to advance to manipulate legal arguments to advance a political agenda that I mentioned earlier, but also to address the confusion around the Palestinian refugee status and rights as refugees and stateless person, among others, which I found in my experience impacted the life of millions of them still in need for international protection, not only in UNRWA's areas of operation, but wherever the dispersal has taken them and is taking them. So this proves to be the case. This discrimination proves to be real each time a Palestinian refugee is confronted with the application of international law based on them being Palestinian refugees before asylum or immigration officers in courts, or simply at a border where they are considered not much as refugees, but as Palestinians. So now, while in other countries that including in Europe, North America, and Asia Pacific countries, this is more obscure and muted, and often originates from genuine confusion about who Palestinian refugees are and what is the protection regime established for them. So I felt that it was necessary to insist on the full picture of the Palestinian refugee question from the origins and evolutions and ramifications to present day, bringing in different analytical dimensions, historical, legal, and political, all in one piece. And this is, in a nutshell, what our book, which is a new book on the foundation of the first edition, as we often say, aims to deliver. So, as I said, I would like to give a sense of its main takeaways, which are, I will focus on 5 or 6 of them, as I would like not to take longer than 10 minutes. So, by examining the Palestinian refugee questions from its origins at the end of the Ottoman Empire, when political Zionism laid its ambitions over Palestine to present-day Israeli policies in occupied Palestine, one can appreciate the continuity of practices to dispossess and displace the Palestinian people. The facts are not new, but the legal reading of those facts, according to various bodies of law applicable at various points in time and according to their intertemporal doctrine, so how law has evolved over time and how the passing of time affects the application of the law is. Second, the picture of Palestinian dispersal that the book offers, surveying numbers, waves of arrivals, status and treatment of Palestinian refugees in around 60 countries around the world, is to our knowledge the most complete overview of the Palestinian dispersal currently available. We warn the reader that the lack of proper recording of Palestinian refugees in national system often makes them statistically invisible. And the lack of accessible data in certain countries blurs the overall picture. But hopefully this will stimulate further research, including on, as I was mentioning, on the discrimination that Palestinians endure and their consequences. From our analysis, it emerges that together with increasing hardship in the protection they enjoy in Europe and North America, the worsening conditions in UNRWA's areas of operation and hostility in the Arab world are pushing Palestinian refugees toward what we call the new frontiers of their exile. One example is Southeast Asia, where I live and where I've surveyed for the first time Palestinian refugees, and where they experience all sorts of challenges because there are no previous diasporic ties, which are essential to any refugees and to any refugee. And also there is a very precarious refugee regime. There is no refugee regime at all, in fact, in most countries in Southeast Asia. And this is
are they refugees? Are they considered refugees in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, by UNHCR, those who manage to get registered by UNHCR are, but not under national, they are irregular migrants under the national regimes, for example, in Thailand, in Indonesia, or in Malaysia. So they can be detained and arrested. This is what happens. Many Palestinians in Indonesia have reported themselves to the authorities because they had no means to survive. It's really outrageous. And these are people who were escaping not a conflict, as well as coming from Saudi Arabia, which had not renewed after decades of living there, not renewed their permits. And there are, however, we can return to this.
Yeah.
But what I mean to highlight is that often, we know that it's common knowledge that as of the 90s, Palestinians have been increasingly displaced from within the Middle East without considering the 250,000 that have been displaced by Israeli policies from the OPT. There are 700,000 Palestinians, mainly descendants, children and grandchildren of those who were displaced in 1947 and 1948 and in 1967, if not refugees themselves, from the Arab countries, often multiple times. And this is as the same number of the Nakba. So this is the situation we point to, and it gives food for food for thought. Third, the book provides a critical analysis of the distinctive regime that is set up for Palestinian refugees within I insist on this, the international refugee framework, moving beyond the often portrayed exceptionalism and clarifying the extent to which international protection applies to Palestinian refugees. We offer a new updated interpretation of the admittedly not very clear Article 1D of the 1951 Geneva Convention on the status of refugees, which is foundational of the distinctive regime available to Palestinian refugees. This article is, without getting into technicalities, but please just let me argue that this article is commonly interpreted as saying that Palestinian refugees fall under UNRWA's mandate, while all other refugees worldwide fall under UNHCR mandate. In fact, a careful assessment of its genesis and institutional context within which the article is set suggests a different interpretation. First of all, in 1949, while the drafting of the 1951 Convention and UNHCR status was ongoing, the United Nations General Assembly had already deliberated how to solve the Palestinian refugee question, first and foremost through the United Nations Conciliation Commission for Palestine, whose mandate was to achieve a negotiation over the whole question of Palestine, including the refugees. No one back then had a doubt that these people were legitimate refugees. No one had a doubt, apart from Israel, for obvious reasons, had a doubt that they had to be allowed to return. And this is but because peace proved unachievable in the short run, another mechanism was created to provide relief to the distressed refugees and to support the political mandate of UNCCP, and this was UNRWA. And this second part of the mandate is often forgotten, but there is a memorandum of understanding between UNCCP and UNRWA, and this is why the archives are precious, which explain these dynamics and why I go back to what you were saying in the beginning. We cannot understand the regime, the international protection regime set up for Palestinian refugees without understanding the intent behind it. Doesn't matter if UNCCP is operating or not. The intent was to deliver international protection, and if UNCCP is no longer there, it's up to UNRWA, and the General Assembly can help the agency further explain it, but to deliver its mandate together with UNHCR. Because in fact, what has happened? UNCCP's mandate has been de facto suspended as of the 60s because of its the difficulty of negotiating between supporting negotiation between the parties. But since over time, the role of UNRWA has expanded, and we discuss this in detail. So I refer to the book, but also its cooperation with UNHCR progressively as expanding as the dispersal of Palestinian refugees outside UNRWA's areas of operations as of the 80s grew. So this cooperation is essential to understand the protection that is to be delivered to Palestinian refugees. Another connected to this element, another important takeaways of our book is the clarification of the definition of Palestinian refugees according to the various bodies of law and according to the various agencies dealing with them. And in the interest of time, I reserve to elaborate further in the discussion. Another important element is the international protection regime that we describe. As I said, we bring the discussion beyond exceptionalism. So by analyzing the question of Palestinian refugees within the development of the international refugee framework, we understand that there is nothing exceptional Palestinian refugees, and mandate, the institutional mandate that was provided to them 72 years ago. In fact, 72 years ago, UNHCR and the Refugee Convention were not supposed to be the universal instruments that they are today. UNHCR initially dealt with European and Soviet refugees, and all territorial partition generated refugees, as the Korean, the Indian, Pakistani, the Palestinians, were outside of it. What is unique for the Palestinians is that while the other situations have been solved, the Palestinians has not. Another element that we use in the book is this holistic approach to international law to analyze their case, meaning we discuss over the span of 72 years the development and meaning of various bodies of law, the law of stateless person, human rights law, refugee law, and humanitarian law, and notions of international criminal law for their value and the remedies they offer to Palestinian refugees. And this is very important, not only in relation to establish the rights that Palestinian refugees have vis-a-vis Israel, but for the rights they have in situations of conflict everywhere they are, where they've been persecuted because of their Palestinian identity or because of their protection they should enjoy as stateless person as human being. And we also offer an examination of what human rights bodies have said over the years about Palestinian refugees. Last but not least, international refugee law. As I said, not only we clarify the regime established under Article 1D, but we look at how international law refugee law has helped resolve other complex refugee situations and how its development could be of relevance to the Palestinian refugee case. And the New York Declaration and comprehensive refugee framework for refugees offer a very important element for reflection, and we develop based on these the elements of what could constitute a comprehensive refugee framework for Palestinian refugees, hinging on the law, hinging on the rights of the refugees, rather than the negotiations, because the asymmetry between the parties does not allow.
Exactly. That's what I didn't understand. I want to ask Lex to quickly summarize that last chapter, because in the last chapter, Francesca and Lex, you propose this new framework. How far is it a departure from previous initiatives, and how far does it build on it?
Good, I'm unmuted. Yes, yes, Nadine. We you know, it is essentially what we're proposing is to move away from the discourse to date on Palestinian refugees and on solutions for Palestinian refugees. We propose a fundamental change, a fundamental paradigm shift. As you're aware, and as was one of the triggers of the Chatham House project on Palestinian refugee issues, the Madrid and Oslo processes got the refugee issue sort of essentially as a bilateral issue between Israel and the Palestinians. And we have seen that, you know, first, it is not a bilateral issue. The host countries have to be involved, and so is the international community. But essentially, it has also shown the last quarter century it has brought nothing. So we argue that it should be that this situation should end, and that the UN must reassume responsibility for the pursuit of solution for Palestinian refugee, like it ultimately does for other refugee crises. And the asymmetry of power that has characterized, you know, this bilateral approach to the refugee issue over the past quarter century simply must end. Then, you know, as part and parcel of that, we also suggest that international law must once again be the lighthouse for approaching solutions to the refugee issue. International law is not able to provide a blueprint, but it clearly sets the framework on the refugee issue. The third element of our proposed paradigm shift is an extension of this, and it addresses the long-held belief that pursuing solutions for Palestinian refugees more holistically would undermine their rights and claims towards, or Palestinians' rights and claims towards Israel, and as such jeopardize the Palestinian cause. We make it abundantly clear in the book that this is not the case at all. For Palestinian refugees, the rights to return, restitution, and compensation flow from the historic injustice accompanying the birth of the refugee issue, and these have only become stronger with the passing of time and the further advancement of international law. And therefore, Palestinian refugees should not fear pursue solutions more closely aligned with the global international refugee regime, as many individual Palestinians have done over the years and others demand. Now, how to get there? We argue that to realize this paradigm shift, the New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants, adopted in 2016 unanimously by the UN General Assembly, provides a unique opportunity to realize this paradigm shift. The declaration was developed in response to the biggest refugee crisis since the Second World War, that we faced in 2014, 2015, with hundreds of thousands of refugees making their way from the Middle East through the Balkan route to Europe. And it constitutes a powerful political reaffirmation of the international refugee regime that was put in place after the Second World War and subsequent decades, including the centrality of international law in protecting the human rights and fundamental freedoms of refugees, and the approach in promoting durable solutions for refugee situations. The declaration underscores the importance of a systematic and comprehensive response in addressing refugee questions, and it calls, amongst other things, for the development of a comprehensive refugee response framework for each large-scale refugee situation, including protracted ones. These comprehensive refugee response frameworks are to be developed through a multi-stakeholder approach with a key role for national and local authorities, international organizations, international financial institutions, civil society, and last but not least, the refugees themselves. It also calls for addressing all aspects of a refugee response, including root causes, ending refugee status and statelessness through a combination of durable solutions and humanitarian assistance. Now, here is the critical part. The New York Declaration applies to all refugees, including Palestinian refugees. While earlier articulations of the international refugee regime had articulated the special status of Palestinian refugees, the New York Declaration made it clear that the Palestinian refugees are covered. And it's not a coincidence that its main authors, Filippo Grandi and Karen Abu Zaid, happen to be former Commissioner Generals of UNRWA.
Of course, yeah.
Now, in spite of the declaration now being adopted 4.5 years ago, to date, no such comprehensive response framework has been developed for Palestinian refugees. And what we suggest that this lacuna be addressed at the earliest opportunity, with UNRWA and UNHCR working together in facilitating this process, each with respect to the Palestinian refugees for which it is responsible. we believe that a comprehensive comprehensive response framework for Palestinian refugees developed under Palestinian leadership, facilitated by UNHCR and UNRWA, and including refugee groups and diaspora networks around the world, has the potential of ending Palestinian exceptionalism and allows for a 72-year-old refugee question to be approached anew with a state-of-the-art 21st century toolbox.
So Lex,
now you may wonder what.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, we've just been. I'm informed that we've just been joined by Urub from Amman. So I was
wonderful.
Yeah, I want to include her in this when you sum up. I mean, I'll give you.
I mean, let Urub come in. I can come back if people have questions about the framework.
Because I have a question. I have several questions for Urub.
I'm happy to address it in response to questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Urub, are you there?
Urub.
Where is she?
Yes.
Hello.
Hello, you can hear me now.
Ah, and we can see you as well. Hi, good to see you.
Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to have you on board. Really had the great pleasure to listen to your presentation, which is such an amazing, another Bible. Lex, we're having another Bible now in our hands. The Bible of the Palestinian refugees. So bravo, Francesca and Lex.
Thank you, Urub. So I have too many questions for you.
Oh my God. I want to ask questions.
I know you're supposed to ask questions, but I want you to tell us very quickly what the Center for Lebanese Studies is doing and on the refugee issue and your work there. And also about your idea of doing research on the Palestinian diaspora and involving it in a solution, which has been really, should have been done a very long time ago. And I think it's a very important initiative that I think you and Francesca are pursuing. And number three is the tricky question. I don't want to create problems between you and Lex now, but you see, Palestinian exceptionalism, which Lex is talking about, has been there since 48 and since the 51, since the creation of UNHCR, because of the rejection of any other solution than right of return. So if you want to include refugees, Palestinian refugees, in a universal refugee regime, then right of return will no longer be the only acceptable one, which is what Article 1, why we have Article 1D and why we have the Palestinians excluded from UNHCR and why all the Arab countries voted for not joining the convention in the 50s. So how do you feel about this, all of these questions in like 4 minutes, 5 minutes?
Well, again, I'm very happy to be with you. And just to answer very quickly your first question, the Center for Lebanese Studies has been expanding for the last few years. And it's been now 2 years that I have been leading the team here in Amman, Jordan, with a project very much studying Palestinian refugees, but also studying Syrian refugees and local Jordanians, where we're doing this kind of comparison in order to understand how the policies of the host state, I may say, is fluctuating when it comes to addressing different groups. So a Palestinian Gazan is not really receiving the same rights as a Syrian, not receiving the same right as a Sudanese. And definitely when it comes to the classes amongst Jordanians themselves, there is this kind of inequality. So what we're doing as Center for Lebanese Studies, we're very much of seeking to be a knowledge-based, knowledge production hub in the region, I know that at the very beginning, when you started the Center for Lebanese Studies, the objective was to do all the studies on Lebanon. I'm afraid we expanded the perspective. So now we're doing, I'm sorry, Nadim. So now we are doing Jordan. In fact, just before joining you, we were discussing a research that will be starting soon on Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. And we're very lucky to have already established our networks in these countries. So this is our very biggest objective, and with us studying the regional, very much of an area study, we are focusing on forced migration. Indeed, we're focusing on education. Education is a very big hub in our center. Disability. We have a very huge network of disability in the region. So we're having multiple, I may call it the hot issues of the Middle East. This is what we're addressing. We're having a little element that we are very much pushing it forward with two of our partners in Canada, which is teaching. It was very funny when we started the discussion 2 years ago. It was very much teaching online, and strangely enough, teaching online has become now the common thing. Everyone now is going online. So we are now into this idea of teaching. We're exploring doing teaching online of forced migration, addressing socioeconomic variables such as education, economy, poverty, etc. This is another thing, and we do produce policy papers. We do produce, particularly, the main focus is research papers and books. And the most important thing as well that we're trying to do is this kind of establishing partnerships. At the moment, we have more than 4 partners that are really working very closely with us. University of Oxford Brookes is a very close partner with us in our current project. Carleton University at Ottawa. We have few partners here within the region. So we are very much establishing these networks, aiming to address all what's needed within the region. Moving on to your second question, and this is really a great opportunity, having Francesca to talk about very much of a proposal Francesca and myself have been seeking to finish. It's exactly like the story of your book, Francesca. I was reading the story of your book and said, that's taken 6 years. So here we are talking about a proposal that's taking us some time. But I must say, building on exactly what Lex has been saying, it's about time for us to look at the diaspora, the Palestinians in exile. First of all, understanding their legal status, understanding what have they been enjoying as human beings. We've talked about, Francesca very well elaborated on the statelessness. So how did they manage to overcome the statelessness, and what is the moment, their real status in these worlds all over the world, and who's really looking into their situation? We're aware of this very much gap that has been eluded. In fact, it's the illusion. I call it the illusion of the gap that has been claimed that UNHCR should not really address the situation of the Palestinians. In the book of the Palestinians of Egypt that I very well talked about it, it was the very beginning, Lex, if you remember, it was in 2002, and it was the very beginning of the revision of the Article 1D. So what has been done ever since, and what has this Palestinian diaspora, Palestinians in exile, what have they been doing? Firstly, from their legal status, and secondly, we're very keen to address, I'm afraid to say, and with Francesca, we've very much addressed the issue of, we often talk about the problems, we often talk about these kind of vulnerabilities, but what about the success stories? What about the role that these Palestinians have managed to play all over the world? Often we talk about the Palestinians in Latin America. What have they done? Where do they stand? And where is their powerful input, capital that has been done all over the world over the last 70 years? Why we don't talk enough about that? And why can't we talk about it when referring to them as Palestinians? This is another issue we're keen to address. Other than the protection, the other point is the economic presence, power. And the last point, coming back also to Lex's point, is the community. Is can we really, and this was a question really, I'm talking about it, but I'm also questioning, in light of this thorough reading of the international tools, isn't there a way for us to see the Palestinians in exile come in one pot, to be able to call, like the other day we were talking about the Welfare Association, which is a Palestinian body. I'm really thinking beyond the lines of the UN, for them really to call for their own rights, bearing in mind the issues and the vulnerabilities they themselves lived. This is something that is very much making us think about looking into these communities, because honestly, we don't know enough about it. Even through the literature, the very thorough, amazing literature review that has been done by Francesca does tell us about the situation, but we are keen to go to the nitty-gritty reality and to understand the issue of the fragmentation, political fragmentation. How did it trickle down on this community on one hand? What are they? How are they communicating with each other? Again, Francesca said, when you were talking about the community in Indonesia, like, are they having the hat of the Palestinians, or are they having the hat of being foreigners? So this is another element that we're very much keen to address. Shall I stop here for you, Francesca, to elaborate?
You still have a question to answer about the exceptionalism.
Yes, answer about exceptional, because I can see that we have a lot of questions from participants. I saw that Fateh Azam just sent a message. I was to salute him, and I saw that we have very important people participating. I wish I could say hello to every single one of them. But tell us about exceptionalism, and let's see what the questions from the floor are, from the participants are.
Hi. Well, the exceptionalism with the right of return. I always say that whenever I'm talking to my students, I always say, why do we always need to see that it's a right? It's only limited to the fact that we really need to call for the right of return for us to be Palestinians. Why I cannot be Palestinian? The Irish community, by the way, is just an example. Why I can't be Palestinian and exist everywhere in the world? Why I can only exist with my rights when I am calling for my return back home? Why can't I enjoy my normal rights as a human being? So one of the things that, unfortunately, after 70 years of exile, we're calling for giving them the basic rights. This is one, giving them the protection. And I loved what Francesca said when she said, it's an obvious right that they could have called for, but unfortunately it has been missed. So the protection that we really need to call for and to have them enjoy it. The right of return should be right of return with their capital, the right of return with their economy, the right of return with their identity, the safeguarding of their existence as Palestinians, beyond the fact that we are just limiting them to being back home. If I see it as a point, because you said, Nadim, that this is not anymore an option. I may not say that it's not anymore an option. We want
No, I did not say that. I said that the Arab countries refused to include the Palestinian cause in the 51 convention because of the insistence on only one option. I didn't say it was not an option. So if you include it in a and this is what is.
No, I also would like to comment on that.
Yeah, please do.
We have a very, essentially, we unravel this, I believe, quite convincingly by making clear in the book that in terms of the quest for protection and the quest for solutions that bring an end to refugee status, we argue and we believe that it is time for Palestinians to more closely embrace also those other solutions, as many individual Palestinians have done and others want to. And we believe that this does not jeopardize their right of return, because the right of return is something that flows from the illegality of the original expulsion of the Palestinians and their denationalization. And that has resulted in historic claims that remain valid wherever refugees find themselves. You know, a Palestinian who has found asylum in the US and lives in a villa in Beverly Hills has as much this historic claim and this right to return and restitution and compensation as a Palestinian who continues to live in a hillway in Lebanon. So this is how we believe the two should be sort of differentiated. You can embrace other solutions in order to restore access to national protection whilst maintaining your historic claims based on the right of return, restitution, and compensation.
Right, thanks. Yeah, that's a very important development. I mean, I remember when this was a hugely controversial issue in our discussions, and you know, 2021, in October 2021, it will be the 30th anniversary of the Madrid conference. So there are Palestinians who were born, I mean, the majority of Palestinians were born with a peace process, with an endless peace process, and with no hope for a solution, with like a dead end peace process. So it's too long, basically, as a period. So Albert, I'm using my phone because of technical reasons. So Albert, do you want to select some of the questions from the participants?
And perhaps while Albert does it, can I just elaborate on your question, Nadim, because I think it's very important. You were right that Arab countries opposed the extension of UNHCR's mandate to Palestinian refugees, but there are a set of reasons, and I really encourage everyone to read the drafting history of the 1951 Convention and of Resolution 194, because this explains the take of the United Nations General Assembly on Palestinian refugees. As I said, first of all, for Palestinian refugees, the refugee status is just part of their history. It's much more complicated. And in fact, you can still be Palestinian refugee, meaning with the entitlement of the question of Palestine being unsettled, even if you are a citizen of a state, which means losing the protection under the 1951 Convention, as meaning the international protection, but not that residual element of protection that stems from the unresolved question of Palestine. This is not unique to Palestinian refugees, but even in my view, the Tibetan and the Western Sahrawi, the Sahrawi refugees, whose refugee question is linked to an unresolved question of self-determination, display the same issue. This is unique. It's clear that this is exceptional. But Palestinian refugees were excluded from UNHCR's mandate because ad hoc responses to refugee crisis was the norm. And they displayed totally different characteristics from other refugees from Europe and Soviet Union, as I was mentioning before, but not from those from other territorial partitions. And one last point: General Assembly Resolution 194 also talks about resettlement. Now Resolution 194 is considered the mother of the three durable solutions, which is return, local integration, and resettlement. So there is nothing new in advocating for the application of the international refugee framework as a whole to Palestinian refugees. Thank you.
Thank you for this clarification. So,
Nadim,
Albert, we need your help with some
So there's
of
a
the
question
questions.
from Fatah Hazam that I think Lex Takkenberg wanted to answer, asking what avenues can be pursued, incremental or comprehensive, to support Palestinian refugees that do not require Israeli agreement or acquiescence.
Yeah, that's exactly coming back to Fateh. Thank you for that question. It's getting us back to our proposal for the development of a comprehensive response framework for Palestinian refugees as a new framework to look at all aspects of the refugee issue, solutions, protection, assistance, and so forth. Because the mandate to pursue this, to develop this, is there through the unanimous adoption of the New York Declaration by all 193 member states of the United Nations, including Israel and the United States. Now, practically, the mandate is there. All that is needed to get moving is sort of a proverbial knot between Guterres, the Secretary General, Lazzarini, the new incoming Commissioner General of UNRWA, and Filippo Grandi, to say, let's work together to implement this existing mandate that the UN General Assembly has so convincingly given, and that also extends to Palestinian refugees. So, you know, the mandate is there. Now, practically, we argue that the process in elaborating such a framework is even more important than the end result, the framework that will eventually result. Because UNHCR in the New York Declaration stipulates that in developing such framework, a multi-stakeholder approach needs to be adopted. Consultations with the host countries in the region, with refugees in the region, with political parties in the region and beyond, international organizations, NGO, academia, and so forth, in a way similar to the development of the Global Compact on Refugees. You know, there were at least 6 drafts of the Global Compact that were debated around the globe intensively, and so the New York Declaration and the approach to this framework for Palestinian refugees, you know, allows for that, and we suggest, you know, that the Secretary General, the Commissioner General of UNRWA and UNHCR agree to a coordinator or a coordinating mechanism, potentially a special representative for Palestinian refugees, to facilitate this process. We also argue in the book that, as the New York Declaration requires, that the discussion includes focus on the root causes of the Palestinian refugee problem, both the underlying historic reasons and trying to arrive at a consensus on the, you know, on the origins and the constituent elements of the Palestinian refugee question, as well as the broader context of the unresolved dispute between Israel and the Palestinians, you know, the present and the unresolved question of self-determination. So, you know, having those discussions under a UN aegis is, you know, really changing the approach on the ground. And we believe, you know, we have no illusion that there will be resistance to it, but we believe that you know, the approach would be able to give a new impetus to international action in favor of Palestinian refugees and their rights. Again, that does not need US or Israeli consent. It also does not need to await and can help advance a more positive outlook on the wider political process. So that in response to Faten's question, Thomas Hammerberg asks, what do we expect the EU to do now for the right? Sorry.
Yeah, Thomas Hammerberg, it's wonderful to see him here. About the EU response. There used to be an EU special committee on refugees, and the EU used to organize the ad hoc liaison committee on refugees. And there was also a group with no name on refugees. All these activities, are they still operational?
Not really. The EU's involvement on the refugee issue has come to a complete halt. And essentially what European politicians and diplomats do is sort of continuing to sort of shield behind the two-state solution, and therefore the Madrid paradigm, which means essentially accepting that Israel can continue to veto any progress on the refugee issue. So we also argue that the EU needs to embrace, really embrace this call in the New York Declaration for a framework for all refugee situations, including the Palestinian refugee situation. Acknowledge that the two-state solution is dead, and that therefore a new paradigm is called for. I think the EU, especially in the aftermath of sort of the Trump administration. I mean, Biden, things look promising with the appointment of Bill Burns as the new CIA director, and others who are very familiar with the Middle East, the past Middle East, past peace discourse in the Biden administration. But I really believe it's critical that the EU at this moment also sees the moment and really steps in and no longer sort of shields itself and hides itself sort of behind the empty shell of Madrid and the two-state solution, which everybody knows is not going to happen, is no longer feasible.
And the quartet, is it still, I mean, there was a quartet report in 2017, which sort of set a framework for the work of the SRSG in Jerusalem, I think. And some of it has been very productive, especially in Gaza. I'm talking about Ambassador His Excellency Mr. Mladenov's work. Now, and he's now left. So is there do we have a vacuum there in the quartet, in the UN representation in Jerusalem, in UNRWA leadership? Are we facing a vacuum?
Effectively, I mean, I don't know whether Francesca wants to come in or Roel.
Yeah.
Effectively, yes, we do face a vacuum. All the attention has been focused on sort of managing the conflict, managing the refugee issues through trying to scrape by and make sure there is enough money for UNRWA. That's where all the diplomatic focus goes. And there is virtually no thinking on solutions. I mean, of course, a big part of it was the global shock triggered by Trump and Trump's approach to global issues, and in particular Trump's approach to the unresolved Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Knocking off the Jerusalem issue, accepting sovereignty over the Golan Heights, and then attacking the refugee issue. And so yes, there is a paralysis and a paralysis with an effective vacuum, and it's a unique time and opportunity for people to step in, and was very good to see that the International Crisis Group has recently called for new approaches, and we're very happy. Francesca and I are very happy with the engagement and the space for discussion on Palestinian refugee issues and the broader question of Palestine that the impressive Jordanian NGO ARDD is creating, to essentially take the place that the Chatham House Project has filled for over 2 decades to discuss policy implications and related issues surrounding, Palestinian refugees and the broader question of Palestine in the region, led by an organization in the region with the global.
So, okay, now that, Francesca, now that there's a question from Mr. Nassim Hafar, and it follows from what you've been saying. So now that Trump is gone, do we expect the new Biden administration to return funding of UNRWA or to channel the funding through USAID and other channels to avoid opposition? I mean, is that?
I'm happy to take this question, although I do not have the power to predict the future. I do expect, it's not unlikely that they will restore funds, because this discussion has been held among Democrats in the Congress, even during the administration. So, but this is the minimum bearable that is owed to the refugees, and surely it's not enough. For me, this is another way to avoid dealing with the problem. So, in as much as restoring UNRWA's fund is essential, there is a need to focus on the needs of Palestinian refugees on the ground, because humanitarianism cannot be a response forever. And also there is one point, so the political engagement and treating the Palestinian refugee question as a political issue to solve, again, instead of a humanitarian issue to manage, is essential. And on this one, I think that the European Union needs to be shaken up and brought back to the discussion. It needs to stop reciting the mantra of the two-state solution, because it's the premises for it to happen are not there. So either they work to end the occupation first and foremost, to reduce the instances of apartheid, or otherwise we are not going anywhere with the two-state solutions. One thing I would like to add.
Why is the two-state solution possible? The state of Palestine technically exists and has been announced in 1988. It's been recognized by 139 countries. And Abu Mazen in 2011 asked for the UN to accept it as a member, forgetting about, and he in effect said, in that speech, which I think was ignored because of the Arab Spring and all that, he in effect dismissed Oslo and said, let's bypass final status and go straight to a two-state solution. Isn't that still a possibility?
I didn't comment on the existence of Palestinian statehood. I just said, they cannot just recite the mantra of the two-state solution with the illusion that it will happen by itself. I said it will not happen unless they create the political conditions to persuade Israel, first and foremost, to relinquish the occupation of Palestine. There is no possibility. One issue that we argue in the book is that to realize the self-determination, you need the realization of various elements of it, internal and external. And paradoxically, the Palestinian statehood is manifesting itself through the paraphernalia of the state and its internal self-determination to an extent. But how can you have full self-determination under foreign occupation and alien occupation and control, which is the very denial of the self-determination? So, I'm encouraging European Union to walk the talk. as simple as that. I'm not
Right.
saying that the Palestinian
Yeah.
state doesn't exist.
Okay, now there are so many other questions. I can see one from a very relevant one from Hadi Farah, which is a proposal to issue Palestinian passports to refugees, which would help resolve their status in some of the countries, mainly Lebanon or Syria or others.
Mm.
Is there, do you want to address this? But we need to finish in about 7 or 8 minutes. What we have shown so far is that this is really a very hot issue and that you've done a huge service to the cause by bringing this reference book for people to look at and follow up on. And so I want to give each one of you 2 to 3 minutes to address some of the issues raised in the questions and to wrap up, please.
I mean, I'm happy to take the stateless. I mean, the issue of the passport. Okay, the Palestinian embassies, to an extent, are already issuing passports, but the passport, as an expression of citizenship, represents is the document that represents the bond between the citizen and the state. That in the case of Palestinian refugees has not been fully legally explored, in order not to create further anxiety among Palestinians in exile, until there is a fully sovereign and independent Palestinian state. A passport has a limited value, if not as a laissez-passer, to be recognized as Palestinian and to be granted protection. But would it allow Palestinians to return to Palestine as citizens if they want so? This is not going to happen until there is an occupation in place, an occupation along the lines of what we see today. So I'm not saying that having proper documentation is not relevant, but it is not going to solve the problem.
Okay.
And we deal with the issue of the enduring statelessness of Palestinians in the book quite extensively, frankly.
So in the last few minutes, Lex and Orub and Francesca, what's next? What do you propose to be done next? We have paralysis.
I mean,
we have no negotiation.
No. I saw a question from Orub saying, you know, how can we revitalize the 194 right to return? I believe there is no need to revitalize 194. 194 has been reconfirmed hundreds of times by numerous UN resolutions over the years. And we argue, and I believe in a very convincing manner, based on the law as it stood in the 1940s, that even without 194, Palestinians would have a right to return, a right to restitution, a right to be compensated. Why? Because international law has advanced up to that point, stipulated that mass expulsion and denationalization of refugees amounted to war crimes. This was acknowledged. It was based on existing humanitarian law in the first half of the 20th century, and was acknowledged by the Nuremberg tribunals, both in the charter of the two tribunals and in the rulings of the Nuremberg tribunal itself. And interestingly, the travaux préparatoires of 194, you know, makes it clear that it's sort of the same lawyers that were a few years earlier drafting the charter of the Nuremberg tribunals were now sort of dealing with the fallout of one of the consequences, indirect consequences of the Second World War. You know, what to do with the Palestinian refugee issue in the broader unresolved Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So, you know, that's not the issue. The historic claims are very well underpinned by international law. There's no need for new resolution. What is needed is work to strengthen the preparation for the time that it will be possible by Palestinians to pursue those claims. You know, and there we recall in the book that it took ages for Israel to be able to pursue war crimes claims, compensation claims vis-a-vis Germany. So what we argue for is that preparatory work is intensified. Now we tend to forget that the UNCCP in the first 15 years of its existence, before it sort of got defunct, you know, carried out a momentous task in documenting every piece of Palestinian property down to individual olive tree in minutiae detail as a foundation for compensation. Now, recently work has been done, different Palestinian initiative to turn that incredibly rich resource into a database that can be used, amongst other things, can be used for research and for multiple purposes, but also as a foundation for future international claims. At the same time, UNRWA is modernizing its registration system, is preparing to create an interactive refugee portal whereby all of the 5.7 million Palestinian refugees around the world can request login credentials so that they can see the data that UNRWA has been stored about their families. And as part and parcel of that modernization, there is also consideration of linking that to the UNCCP property records. And that would constitute a very powerful, what I call home for right of return, you know, a visible demonstration that the historic claims of the Palestinian refugees are safe and are prepared for the day it will be possible to pursue them. Now, if that would happen, I also believe strongly that the attachment of Palestinian refugees to UNRWA as the manifestation of their unresolved status and right of return will gradually diminish. That it will be possible to reform UNRWA. It will be possible to work towards, for example, an improvement of living conditions of Palestinians in Lebanon and in Syria post-conflict. I don't want to speak about full integration, but you know, if it is clear to the refugees that their historic claims are safe, you know, they no longer need to, you know, remain in miserable conditions in camps in the region. So there's really a lot possible, and I think we're running more than my 3.
You took more than your 3 minutes.
Yeah, you took my 3 minutes and Rube's 3 minutes.
And Rube's 3 minutes. Oh, and CCP still exists. It's not now defunct. Technically, CCP is there. And there's still director of
it's never been.
Yeah.
It's never been abolished.
So, Francesca and Orub, can we have your quick closing statements, because we have.
Yeah, and thanks to everyone for the patience and for being with us. So, look, my final remark is the following: we have no illusion that international per se cannot provide an easy way out of the current impasse in the Israeli-Palestinian questions, but we approach it as a powerful tool to challenge the current state of affairs in the various dimensions that we have touched upon tonight, and to establish a principled order at various levels. Now, I think that among those who willfully prefer to ignore the fact, there is an illusion that the Palestinian, including some organizations, institutions, and policymakers, there is an illusion that the Palestinian refugee problem will eventually disappear by inertia, and an international community and Israel alike can continue with a policy of kicking the can down the road indefinitely. But the truth behind all this fact is that no people on earth, less the Palestinians, would accept a peace that is premised upon the denial of an injustice that has befallen them, whose matrix continues to determine present and future of an entire people. Knowing that and accepting that will push us toward considering solutions, not only for the well-being of the Palestinians, but for the host societies that host them and will continue to host them.
Thank you. Arup, are you still there? Thank you.
I'm really
Arup?
sorry. I was disconnected several times. Very, very quick word. This book is such an amazing tool that is pushing us to reread or to read through, in my point of view, very important 3 tools. 194 with the call for protection. And it seems that we're missing it out. I appreciated very much what you emphasized, Francesca and Lex, in this book. Secondly, the other word, which is another important one, the UNCCP. And I love that fact that you said, it is there. The UNCCP did call for protection. It got, somehow this agenda got aborted, but we really can read it again and really read through the lines. And this is what we have been missing. And in my point of view, you are providing for us such a rich material that we really need to work through it in order to strongly present the rights that are there, but we missed out these rights because we didn't read well or enough the legal tricks that concern the rights of the Palestinians. So this is such an important tool that we have in our hands. Thanks for all the work done in there that really can push us for milestones ahead of us in order to gain back rights for the Palestinians, activating multiple tools that you are presenting in your conclusion. So thank you. Thanks Trillian for that work.
Thank you all very much. I have bad news for you, Lex. If you are thinking of retiring in the French countryside and growing potatoes, I think we still need you for a very long time because you are our reference. And thank you, Francesca, for your contribution and carry on the work, and Rube and the Center for Lebanese Studies for their work. And what we have shown is that this is a very lively issue with a lot of interest, and we could have, there is a need for a lot more meetings like this to discuss it. Thank you all very much, and good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.